Now, global sea levels could rise by more than 2 meters by the end of this century if emissions continue unchecked. This would swamp major cities like New York and Shanghai and displace up to around 185 million people. Information from a brand new study that also says sea levels may rise faster than previously estimated due to the accelerating melting of ice sheets in both Greenland and Antarctica. Lead author on that study is Professor Jonathan Bamber, Professor of Physical Geography at the University of Bristol in the UK, and is with me now on Monday lunchtime. Professor, good afternoon to you. Just reading that intro sends chills up one's spine. Is this data that you have gathered worse than you thought?
It is, yes. We carried out a similar kind of study, which is called a bit technical, called a structured expert judgment, about 8 years ago, I think, where we looked at the evidence for contribution to sea level from the ice sheets. That's where most of this sea level rise is going to come from. And the number was about half that 8 years ago. And the reason it's increased, it's like more than doubled in the last 8 years is because of our improved understanding of some of the processes that control mass loss from the ice sheets. So, yeah, I think these numbers are pretty terrifying, to be honest.
Are we starting at this point in 2020 then to see evidence of displacement and destruction?
There's not our study, but there's a really nice study by one of the co-authors of this paper that we published recently, a guy called Bob Koch, where he shows that sea level rise over the last few decades, the rate is higher than it has been during the Common Era. That's the last 2,500 years. And the actual sea level itself, the height of the sea right now, is higher than it ever has been over the last 2,500 years. So we're seeing unprecedented in the last 2.5 millennium, changes in sea level over the last few decades. And we're pretty confident. There's also a lot of evidence that suggests that that's due to anthropogenic global warming.
Professor Bamber, you're talking to a television station in Africa, so let's focus on the southern hemisphere very quickly, if we could, and the shoreline around Africa and southern Africa specifically. How is it or would it be affected if the current trend continues?
Well, that's a great question. I don't have those numbers to hand. I mean, any low-lying land, coastal low-lying land, will be affected by a sea level rise of 2 meters. I don't have the numbers for Africa and where the vulnerability is. I know that there are parts, so for example, the Nile Delta, which is not southern Africa, but, northern Egypt, that will be very seriously affected. The Nile Delta is the breadbasket of northern Africa. Once the Nile Delta is flooded by seawater and that very fertile arable land is contaminated by salt, then it becomes a lot less fertile, and there's some very serious consequences around arable production. But for southern Africa, I'm afraid I can't tell you the numbers.
Fair enough, I do accept that. Just a final question to you then. It's easy to scaremonger around stories like this. I'm wondering if we've left it too late. Is there a short-term remedy that is now available? What kind of window do we have?
Short-term remedies, quick fixes. I don't think there's anything like that. Not for sea level rise and not for the ice sheets. The ice sheet covering Antarctica. The Antarctic ice sheet is bigger than the conterminous USA. It's 1.5 times the size of Australia. It's the biggest, slowest component of the climate system. And once you send it in a particular direction, once you kick it off, it's very, very difficult, and it takes a very long time to change that trajectory, to sort of move it in another direction. You can think of it like a super tanker of the ocean-going world. It's once it's got going, it's going to be centuries before you can shift it in a different direction. So I think there are no easy fixes. What I would say in answer to that question, though, is that we have some control over the rates, how quickly things change, how quickly sea level rise goes up, how rapidly the ice sheets and glaciers around the world respond. And that's by mitigating carbon emissions and reducing temperature rise globally. The more we can do that, the slower the rate will be. But we are committed to significant sea level rise right now, and there's no quick fixes to that one.
Professor Jonathan Bamber at Bristol, thank you very much for joining us. A disturbing conversation, I'm sure you'll agree.